You're listening to the Unsiloed Podcast with Greg LeBlanc, produced by University FM. Unsiloed is a series of interdisciplinary conversations that inspire new ways of thinking about our world. So wherever you are, enjoy today's episode, and here's your host, Greg LeBlanc.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Michael Clune, who is a professor at Case Western University, and also the author of a couple books, the one I have right here, called A Defense of Judgment, but also a couple other books, both memoirs and fiction, one called Game Life, one called Whiteout, and another one called Pan, which is coming up soon. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about how it's possible to live a life of both creator and critic, because I always thought that being a critic kind of made it more difficult to actually, in one ear you got the critic talking and the other one you got the creator talking. But I do want to talk about this book, Defense of Judgment. So first of all, welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So this book reminded me of some similarities that I had observed a long time ago between modern literary criticism and economics. And I think you make some of these allusions in the book and some of these references. I remember I spent about 5 years at Duke, sort of at the height of the, postmodern critical movement, right?
Yep.
And all of my friends who were in the literature departments and the English departments, they wanted to resist aesthetic judgment. They thought aesthetic judgment was a problem. And they thought that the idea of a hierarchy, the idea of a canon, the idea that there were better and worse works of literature was profoundly non-egalitarian. And I realized that, economists have more or less the same perspective, right? Where, we say de gustibus, like whatever people like, that's what they like. And who are we to step in and say that this thing is more worthy of your attention and your desire than anything else? I mean, it's a relatively recent movement, but why is it that this came to pass? I mean, how did this happen? And I think that's the story of your book.
Yeah, it's a great question, Greg. And there's a longer history and there's a shorter history, a longer cultural history and a shorter discipline-specific history as regards the study of the arts in universities and why they came to abandon judgment, the practice of saying one work is better than another work, which many folks out there probably still imagine is at the core of literature departments. But in fact, the academic study of literature and the arts has, as you say, moved away from that over the last few decades.
Now, to be clear, I mean, when syllabi are constructed, they're not constructed using a dartboard. Right?
That's right. I argue that part of my argument is that actually there's no coherent way to do literary study or to teach art history without making judgments all the time. That's just the nature of it. And what's fascinating is why so many professors in these fields have felt compelled to disguise the fact that they're making judgments. So that's what kind of interests me, is the disavowal of judgment or the pretense that we're not making judgments. To take a wider sort of view on this, I understand the movement to hostility to aesthetic judgments to really be an outgrowth of a phenomenon that Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, probably the greatest book ever written on America, about his time in the 1830s of a French nobleman visiting the relatively new United States. He talked about egalitarianism as the fundamental distinguishing characteristic of American culture and society, and viewed the commitment to equality as sort of rolling across all elements and features of culture, flattening distinctions between high and low as it went. Okay, so the idea that there's no public standard for distinguishing great art from mediocre art, from art that is not worth your time, is profoundly counterintuitive and strange. And how we got to that point is basically this interesting transformation of the principle of equality. Now, all of us, I take it, most of us in America at any rate, are committed to the principle of the equality of persons. People should be equal before the law, people are of equal moral worth, and so forth. What you see happening starting in the late 19th century and continuing in the 20th century is the extension of the principle of the equality of persons to the equality of consumer preferences. And this is a dramatic change. It's a change that, so now the idea is whatever anyone happens to like in terms of art, in terms of culture and so forth, they should be the sole arbiter of that decision. And this presents as a kind of egalitarian move, a move against snobbery, against elitism of all kinds. But what I argue is that, in fact, to say that there's no public standard for judging some works better than the other, and to say that everyone should make their own judgments, and professors and critics and museum curators shouldn't try to tell people what's good and what's not, that presents as like, oh, everyone gets to choose, there's no public standard. But in fact, what you actually see happening is that it's the replacement of one standard, the judgment of those educated in the arts, by another standard, which is the marketplace. And so bestseller lists basically replace the canon that's constantly changing and there's all of complex judgments, but that's basically the displacement. So in fact, it's not really an egalitarian move in the way that many of its proponents take it to be. It's actually a disavowal of the expertise of aesthetic educators and throwing everything to the kinds of orderings produced by the marketplace.
Well, what's interesting is that you point out that the early economists like John Stuart Mill and Marshall, I mean, they did not think that all preferences were equal. I mean, their utilitarianism was somewhat nuanced, right? I mean, Mill famously distinguishes between, what is it, poetry and pushpin. I'm always had to try and figure out what the hell pushpin was, right? I don't know. It's like pin the tail on the donkey, or I don't know what it is. But the idea was that there are higher and lower uses of one's time. But the marginal revolution with Walras and Menger and Jevons, I mean, they also kind of understood this. I mean, they knew there was a place for this, but they said that if we introduce that, there's no way to actually create a tractable model. So it kind of became a, for modeling convenience, right? The economists decided to just abandon this idea.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, John Stuart Mill, who was reacting to Bentham, wrote that famous essay on Wordsworth, was, sort of profoundly committed to the difference between what he called higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And the neoclassical moment is really interesting because you're right, they introduced it kind of as a heuristic, as a way to let's just see what kinds of choices are actually being made by consumers and try to construct models on that basis. And some of them actually viewed the economy as almost along the analogy with something like evolution, where economic choices would sort of naturally produce out of their own dynamics a kind of separation between the higher and the lower. But when you get this marginal revolution folded into the larger culture and the egalitarian movement that de Tocqueville had already seen being in place in America for over a century at that point, what you in fact get is this overwhelming animus, get the castigation of any effort of anyone to say some things are better than others, some pleasures are higher than others. And this picks up steam. Well, one sort of philosophical moment that I think about is the movement from William James to John Dewey. And William James has a famous essay called On a Certain Blindness in Human Beings. And it's just a case for aesthetic education. And he says to his audience, you and all of us most of the time experience life less fully than we might, see things less clearly than we might, and art, great art, can help us to transform us. When you get to Dewey in Art as Experience, you get this different sort of torquing of the question of art. And Dewey, his main polemic is against what he calls snobbery. Any effort to say that some works are better than others. And this is already in the 1930s. You get the sense that the battle that critics and philosophers are fighting in culture is against snobbery. And now at the time, in the 1930s, that makes a certain sense. For sure, there's a class of people that use, as Veblen and others demonstrated, that use their taste in Italian painting or in German music to distinguish themselves on a class basis. But as the century goes on, that becomes less and less true. And the idea that when you get to the 1990s, in the scenario you're discussing, that there's a serious problem with wealthy people using their love of Shakespeare, Beethoven to lord it over the working class is preposterous. That's just not how class formation works. It's not how economic inequality works anymore. And what you instead have is, I view, this really perverse idea that everything is consumer choice and everything gets folded into the marketplace.
Well, look, I think if we go back to that economic story combined with the Darwinian story, I mean, the notion is it's similar to the idea that the marketplace for ideas will percolate up the truth. The marketplace for art will percolate up the beautiful. And to some extent, there's truth in that, except that those markets usually have agents that are trying to do this. So to the extent that the marketplace for truth actually works, it's because you've got scientists that are in the role of sorting out, truth from fiction. And presumably the literary scholars, critics, and professors, their work is necessary if that market is to function, right? I mean, yeah, you can't just sort of step back and expect it to happen spontaneously.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, Tyler Cowen, who's an economist that many people know, wrote a book about this issue. I think it was around 2000. I think it's called In Defense of Commercial Culture. And he makes exactly that point. He says that the way the market by itself creates and supports good art, and Tyler does view good art using a value scheme that's distinct from merely monetary value. But he says markets can do that just because you've got so many critics embedded in the process. But what happens, and this is really, really amazing, in the last 2 decades especially, this was not so much true when Tyler Cowen wrote the book at the year 2000, but it became increasingly true, is that as journalism as a field kind of comes under incredible assault and sheds jobs and becomes more and more oriented to getting clicks and getting subscribers and so forth, you see a corresponding movement where critics working in the public sphere themselves begin to internalize the idea that to make judgments is a kind of snobbery and elitism. And so you get the situation in which there's a general disavowal of aesthetic judgment as distinct from consumer choice. And the analogy would be what would happen. I love the analogy you used with respect to the marketplace of ideas. The analogy would be what would happen to the marketplace of ideas if a physicist was no longer seen as having any peculiar authority in the field of physics versus a layman. Well, you get something like we've sort of begun to see, which is a broad skepticism of science. And part of my point is these two features, a kind of skepticism of science and a skepticism of aesthetic judgment, are two sides of the same coin, which is a general egalitarian distrust of expertise, of experts, and the idea that anyone should have any more authority on any judgment or choice, more authority than me, the average consumer or citizen.
But wait, I mean, I know plenty of professors of English and literature, and they, they're not going to tell you that they're not experts. I mean, they consider themselves to be experts. And so if they're not experts in aesthetics, then what are they experts in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something I've thought a lot about, essentially starting in the 1970s, but really you don't see this spreading until the 1990s. You get a transformation of the profession's sense of what the basis of their expertise is. And John Guillory, in a famous book called Cultural Capital, published in the early 90s, he made this, what he said was, look, you've got this bizarre spectacle of all these literature professors who say that they're unable and unwilling to say that Milton is better than Stephen King. In other words, they don't consider themselves experts in making aesthetic judgments, but they have no problem at all making moral and political judgments of every kind. And so what you begin to see is the displacement of the idea that literary study and literary expertise is about making judgments about literary works, about having a mastery of literary history and so forth, and an idea that what literary expertise consists of is a kind of understanding of large-scale political dynamics, racial dynamics, gender dynamics, and so forth, which would authorize the kind of publication of thousands and thousands of books saying this is what colonialism is and how it's working now and so forth. And the irony is, and this is something that we've seen in the last few years coming to a real point, is that that model of expertise is indefensible. If I'm an English professor, I have a case to make to the public that I know something about the history of literature and about literary judgment, about close reading. Nothing in my training or my field of study gives me any authority on making political judgments or moral judgments. And as you see that kind of the adoption of what's in my view a completely indefensible model of the humanities expert, that also tracks very closely with the decline of the humanities, both in terms of prestige, in terms of enrollment, in terms of funding. And so in my view, it's been a disaster for the discipline, but it has resulted in, and I see this all the time, English professors who are masters in political discourse or political strategy, or discourse broadly conceived, or language broadly conceived, some other large-scale body of knowledge that, in fact, they find it very hard to make a case to the public or to students that they are, in fact, experts in that field, that their pronouncements on these issues have any value at all.
So when they're selecting what to put into their syllabus, they're selecting things that help to illustrate particular theses about how the world works or operates. But I mean, isn't there another strain of expertise which is concerned with formal characteristics of the work? You know, how the text works, how it operates, how innovative it is, or I guess you talk about this word interesting, like this work is kind of more interesting than the other, perhaps for formal reasons.
Yeah. So this change that I was describing from the dominant way of thinking about what English is was never completely successful. In other words, many, and people argue with me, and I have a hard time understanding myself whether this would be a kind of silent majority, to use that term, in the profession or not. But many professors, they got into this because they love literature, they know about literature, and they like to teach literature. So many people have still been doing this work of close analysis of literary texts, attention to formal criteria, formal features, and so forth. However, even here, this is proceeded under a widespread sense that, well, somehow we should do analysis and not judgment. In fact, when I was in grad school, my advisor told me, he said, appreciation or judgment is something that happens outside the academy. What we do is analysis, not appreciation. But that distinction seemed to me, as my career went on, increasingly hard to justify. In fact, just by virtue of putting certain works on my syllabus, I'm telling students, in effect, these works are worth your time and attention, and all various other works are not, right? If I'm teaching Moby Dick, as I just did this semester, that book's hard to read. It's difficult. It's not one that students would choose to read on their own in many cases. And yet, by putting it there, I'm saying, trust me on this, right? I'm going to show you, we're going to discover things in this work that are rewarding, that are richer, that are stranger, that really make this work of great value, of enormous aesthetic value. And so I'd even go a step further, which is to say that judgment of value often has to precede analysis in some ways. And this was a really important moment in the history of English as a discipline. In the earlier part of the 20th century was the development of a skill we call close reading. And close reading has come to be seen just as the analysis of the language of a text. But in fact, the critics who originally, called the new critics, who originally developed this program, the idea was that certain works repay this close attention and certain works do not. Certain poems, by careful attention to the language of the text, will reveal connections, depths, richness of imagery and symbol, resonances between text and context that most works do not have. And so by selecting such a text as the site of close reading, as the occasion to tell the class, let's look at this very closely and see what happens, not all works will repay that attention. So judgment and analysis, in my view, in literary study, are really indissociable.
Well, what's interesting about this judgment is that it seems to be very difficult to systematize. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could take a newly published book and run it through ChatGPT and say, hey, is this one worthy of my attention? And it seems like all attempts to articulate what makes a work better are going to fail. Although you said, if I can't imagine writing an academic article about why I want to read this thing, then maybe I ought not to read it. I mean, this judgment seems like a tacit skill, one that's difficult to formalize.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So aesthetic judgment is not something that can be done according to rules and laws laid out in advance. For reasons that there's a rich philosophical history, David Hume, and then most famously Immanuel Kant, said in Kant's formulation, the beautiful is that which pleases without a concept. There are no rules for that. And when it comes down to sort of the brass tacks of pedagogy, of teaching, and this is a famous thing about literary study. Let's say Moby Dick. You could imagine a version of the class where I just talk about Moby Dick and no one reads it. And I describe how great it is and how wonderful it is and how it's surprising and strange and so forth. You could do that in chemistry. And I'm talking about you could do something like that in economics or in physics. But in literature, the student has to encounter it for him or herself. Like nothing is happening unless they're encountering it for themselves, unless they have the experience in which something magical is disclosed to them. And so the actual practice of teaching literature involves what the chemist and philosopher of science Michael Polanyi described as tacit skills, which is really simply a kind of knowing how without being able to say exactly what you're doing. And so when I'm teaching, very often I'm shifting between moments of analysis and moments where I'm just sort of taking a passage and just telling students, look at this, just look at this, just showing it to them and inviting them from a certain angle to have an experience, to experience what I take to be and what generations of people, of readers have taken to be so remarkable and surprising about the language of this work. And this skill has many different kinds of elements. I'll give you another kind of feature of entering into the work in order to disclose kinds of value that are initially invisible. Polanyi uses the example of a blind person using a cane to navigate a space as an illustration of a crucial aspect of tacit knowledge. And the way I would describe it is for someone like myself and like many other professors and people who are not professors who are educated in literature, there's a certain capacity to enter into a work and to see how the world looks from the perspective opened by a poem by John Keats or by Gwendolyn Brooks. And that's a special kind of skill where you're not just looking at the work as an object, but you're looking at the work as a kind of structure of subjectivity, as a way of perceiving the world. And then viewed from that perspective, the work can invite you in and you can look at other objects of your experience or of your everyday life through that lens. Now, that is something that students initially don't know how to do. It's a skill. It's something that's learned through practice. And it's something, and this is, again, something Polanyi puts a great deal of emphasis on, it's learned by example rather than by a set of rules or a recipe or kind of direction. And so you're continually, as a professor, exemplifying and modeling how one relates to the work in this way. And the goal of literary instruction is not to sort of make a judgment and say, Moby Dick is great, you just have to believe me. It's rather, Moby Dick is great, we're going to have that as a kind of operating hypothesis, and then we're going to develop different skills for allowing you to see in the work what I see and what generations of other readers have seen, and to disclose those peculiar values in your own experience of the work that will give you something new, something important, something valuable. And in fact, after the classes I teach, not everyone, but I would say a majority of students are generally happy to have read Moby Dick, even as they may have resisted it at first.
So I think you've said somewhere in the book that everyone engages in artistic judgment to some degree. It's just that they may do it in a very unskilled way, and you can become more skilled at it. And I think this is a very Humean concept. I mean, this is kind of a neo-Humean argument. And Hume is known for a lot of things. His aesthetics are kind of lower down on the list, right, for all the things he's famous for.
Definitely, yeah.
But maybe, where did we kind of go wrong? I mean, is Kant to blame in part for kind of forgetting this Humean idea of artistic training and skill development for judgment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say my book is a little bit unusual in taking Hume as opposed to Kant as my guide. And I really take Hume, as you suggest, as offering a way of looking at aesthetic judgment as a skill, like learning how to ride a bike or to work with certain kinds of equations or operate a certain tool and so forth. It's a skill. You can get better at it. I've gotten much better at it over my career, and I try to impart that kind of skill to my students. What Hume says, one of the most important things I think Hume says is that in his famous essay called On the Standard of Taste, he says that the standard of taste is the judgment of those who are best educated in the art in question. And what that does is just to say, it adds education into it, right? It adds education into the equation, where he says, and he has another amazing line, which I think about all the time, which he says, many men who, unable to distinguish a fine stroke, he's talking about a visual art painting, by themselves, nevertheless can appreciate such a stroke once it's pointed out to them. That in itself just has the whole model of education there, which is, I have spent a lot of time with painting, right? In Hume's example, I've spent years looking at different paintings, learning about the history of painting, learning about different techniques. Therefore, I'm more skilled in judging a painting than I was when I first encountered paintings. If you're someone who is not that familiar or skilled with painting, you might allow me to show you some things that I'm finding in paintings, to show you some paintings that I think are really valuable. And Hume's idea is that you can learn that, right? You can learn that and learn to make judgments for yourself, to be guided to make better judgments, judgments that you will ultimately find more satisfying and more enriching than the judgments that you had before that education process. So when Kant comes along, Kant's emphasis is different. His philosophical aims are different, but he basically makes two moves that I find unhelpful. One of those is to say that there's this sense called the aesthetic, that aesthetic judgment is different than the way we might judge moral problems or political problems or practical questions and so forth. The reason why I think that's kind of problematic is because it already puts the values you can discover in art into a kind of box, where in fact, if the history of literary reception teaches us anything, is that people get all kinds of insights from literary works and cognitive insights. I'll give you an example of H.G. Wells, the author of The Time Machine, came up, he was the first one to conjoin the words time and travel. That's the aesthetic move. But of course, scientists and physicists reading that work in the aftermath of it, it basically did a lot to popularize the whole idea of time as a fourth dimension, which had all kinds of cognitive and scientific effects. So you can't circumscribe the kinds of things you can discover in literature in advance as the concept of the aesthetic does. Secondly, Kant is interested in the universality of aesthetic judgment, in just the fact that in discovering something beautiful, I won't have any argument to convince you that it's beautiful, but that I'll expect your agreement that it's beautiful. And he places a lot of emphasis on that expectation that you will agree with it. Kant isn't exactly incompatible with Hume, but he de-emphasizes the role of education. And he tends to create a model, which this remarkable book by the Victorianist Linda Dowling lays out, which is that aesthetic educators and aesthetic theorists in the wake of Kant tend to produce accounts of their own aesthetic judgments, which leave out the role education played in those judgments. So they'll say, I just find, with Ruskin, Gothic arts to be rich and beautiful and interesting and so forth. And the working class people, they don't see that. And it can make it look like it's a question of nature. I just see something, I'm John Ruskin, I see something that other people can't see. It doesn't emphasize the role of education, which from my perspective is just, well, look, these working class folks were definitely denied the kind of education that furnished someone like John Ruskin with the tools for making those kinds of judgments.
So this is kind of an idea that you have a primitive capability, aesthetic capability, that through sufficient exposure, you will grow to appreciate the good stuff.
Yeah, everyone has an aesthetic sense. Everyone has a sense of what they like and what they don't like. But we require education to take that a step further, to enrich it, and to even discover, I'll say I'm a first generation college student. I'm an immigrant. My father dropped out of school at 14 in Ireland. So when I got to America, one thing that I was completely fascinated by, now I go to the bookstore and I go to the classics section, and it would be this like sort of mysterious thing. And I really wanted to learn what those books enclosed, like what kinds of perceptions and thoughts and ideas were in there. And right there, I was oriented towards a sense of judgment, a sense that, and this is a really important thing in my life, and also I think for the practice of aesthetic education in general, which is I was operating from a sense that the aesthetic world that I'm in suburbia, lower middle class, 1990s sucks, right? The sitcoms suck. The kind of music on the top 40 radio sucks. The cheap thrillers lying around. The house suck. And I wanted something, so it began with a kind of negativity, like this sucks, I want something better, higher, more powerful, more interesting. And serious literature and art disclose those things, that world to me. Now, if someone had said to me at that point, hey, you're good as you are, you know what I'm saying? The things that you like are just fine. You don't need to change yourself. You don't need to transform your taste. I think that would have been really a kind of deprivation.
Well, it seems like literary judgment requires skills that are similar to what you have in being a good scientist. There's an element of humility. The only way to really evaluate a work of art is ex post. It is going to be different from the criteria you would have used to evaluate it before you consumed it. I mean, that sort of suspension of one's prior criteria and openness to allowing one's criteria to evolve. I mean, that seems to be integral to this project.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, thank you for that. So the poet John Keats, in a famous letter, said, he was talking about what makes a great poet. And for him, Shakespeare was the great poet. And he said the quality that Shakespeare had more than anyone else was what Keats called negative capability, which meant the capacity to sort of be a blank slate and to approach the object with a minimum of preconceptions and prejudices, a kind of openness to the world and to the object. I think that's also true of criticism and of approaching literature, which is when I approach a literary work and when I teach a literary work in class, what I'm trying to do is to see what's actually there. And this is almost impossible, right? Psychology has robustly demonstrated that we tend to see things in terms of what we already know. We tend to project. We tend to take the literary work and understand it in terms of genres and things we've already read that seem like it. And so I always do an exercise with my students in which we'll read a passage from a work, and then I'll ask them, what's this, paraphrase it, what's this work saying? And invariably, they will describe something. They'll say, oh, it's talking about X. And I'll say, okay, where in this passage does it say it? And they won't be able to find it because it's not there, because it's not saying that. They've projected it. The technique of close reading, a very careful attention to a work, is a technology for defeating our tendency to project. We want to get so close and so granular, close to the object, that we can't help but see the fine nuances and turns of phrase and strange developments of image that explode our preconceptions and bring us face to face with something new, with something we haven't thought of or experienced before.
But I mean, you have to have some preconceptions in order to appreciate it, right? You can't go in with a fully blank slate.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's sort of a sweet spot between, in my book, Reading Against Time, I thought a lot about this when I was thinking about the problem of novelty and the aspiration of works to become novel. If something's totally novel, it's noise, right? Just total noise. If something's totally familiar, it's totally dead, right? The mind creates representations of the thing that allow us to more efficiently experience the world, and it just puts it in a box and we don't actually experience it. So what you want is you want to sort of create a certain kind of background knowledge gained from the experience of a lot of other great literary works. And that will allow, paradoxically, that background knowledge will allow what is truly strange and novel in the work to sort of light up. If I'm someone who's not familiar, I'm teaching Jane Austen this semester. And if I'm someone who's never read the literary tradition in which Jane Austen is innovating, all kinds of things that Jane Austen is doing that are really notable and remarkable simply won't show up. I won't have that background knowledge that'll enable it to show up. So you need a certain kind of background knowledge, but you also need a sensitivity to bringing that background knowledge to bear, not in such a way that kind of prepackages or pre-decides on what you're going to discover, but that in fact allows what is unique or novel or particular or strange or surprising in the work to show up sort of starkly and clearly. And that kind of back and forth between, this is the sort of challenge in the art of teaching literature, where I'm constantly thinking about, okay, what kind of background knowledge do the students need in order to see this fascinating thing? And how do I convey that in such a way that doesn't give them a shortcut and sort of robs them of the experience of enjoying the surprising or fascinating aspects of the work? And this is why, and to say this is just to say why Polanyi is completely right, that you can't write a kind of set of rules of how to do this. It's a very kind of back and forth, feeling your way through it kind of process.
So if you start off and say, I'm going to read Jane Austen with the intent to discover all the different ways in which she illustrates the hegemony of the aristocracy or something, right? Then that means you are sort of setting aside your literary skill, literary judgment skill, because you're not going to be surprised by anything. I mean, is that similar? I think it was Helen Vendler who I heard say this, that if you can summarize a work of art, then it's not a work of art. I mean, is there something to that? Is that the idea?
And I love Helen Vendler. Her book on John Keats was hugely important to me. She's an amazing close reader and a writer and a judge. So I would agree and disagree. So it really depends. Even that question is hard to decide in advance. So I'll give you an example of that. In terms of your opening example, you're completely right. If I begin looking at Jane Austen with an idea of discovering the kind of, well, just the idea that women were totally powerless in early 19th century England, if that's my view going in, then I'm not going to discover anything new in the work. I'm going to rather use the work as examples of things I already know. If I go into the work and actually examine it carefully with Jane Austen, and this is happening to my students this semester, what you discover is there's all kinds of forms of feminine agency and power that operates in surprising and complex and paradoxical ways that I would never have been able to see if I went in there just with that kind of idea of what I already know. But the question of summary or paraphrase is complicated. I actually believe that sometimes in some works, what's really remarkable about it is something that you can't get through paraphrase. But there's other cases in which works do yield a kind of knowledge, a kind of insight, which it's totally appropriate to paraphrase or to translate into propositional language. I just use science fiction. In different genres work different ways. Science fiction is a great example of a genre in which the authors are very often in their works describing insights or visions of science and technology that it's totally appropriate to paraphrase and to bring out and to argue with and to think about. I use the example from H.G. Wells, the whole idea that time is the fourth dimension. That's paraphrasable. You can extract it from the text. And I don't think we're doing any violence to the text, or we're not registering its aesthetic power, its artistic power, because part of that artistic power was to generate this fascinating concept that had all kinds of epical influence on all kinds of other fields. So that, again, is just part of my commitment to saying you can't get the criteria before you look at the work. Some works we may discover can't paraphrase. This poem by Emily Dickinson, paraphrase would ruin it. You've really got to look at the language and how she's giving new shape to certain perceptions in ways that when we paraphrase it would be to kill it. In other cases, that's not the case. There's totally things to paraphrase. And that's kind of an unsatisfying answer, because I wish I would be able to say, sort of like Helen Vendler, here's an easy rule to deciding what's serious literary study and serious literary judgment and what is not. But in fact, on reflection on my practice and on the work of the critics I admire, I don't think there's really not much easy you could say before the encounter with the particular work.
Yeah, you made some interesting comparisons between literary criticism or literary judgment and science. And you point to the work of Thomas Kuhn. And I think he said Northrop Frye was, I guess, writing kind of around the same time and kind of thinking similar thoughts about how you can have knowledge which is neither strictly objective or strictly subjective. I mean, how does literary criticism fit in there? Because it's neither purely subjective nor is it objective in the way that we would like it to be.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Again, going back to Hume did not believe. He used the example, I think it was, he compared Milton, who's a poet everyone knows and major figure in literary history, and I think Ogilvy, a minor poet that almost no one reads or even has ever heard about. Hume says that it's just the case that people educated in the arts tend to prefer Milton over Ogilvy. Now, Hume doesn't believe there's any kind of rule or there's something intrinsic that we can break out and say, because he possesses X, Y, and Z qualities, Milton is better than Ogilvy. It's just the case that the kind of subjectivity that education in the arts creates will regularly and reliably lead to those kinds of judgments. And that's what we call the test of time. Some works, many of the works that continue to inhabit lots of our syllabi, especially with the older literature, these are works that generations who work carefully with literature or teaching literature or studying literature, have said, okay, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, Frederick Douglass, these are writers that are great. These are writers that really repay study and are worth reading and rereading and teaching and so forth. Other writers are not so much. Now, that doesn't mean it can't change, but it does mean that there's a certain structure of subjectivity, which is the subjectivity created by a certain kind of training and education in the arts, that picks out features of works that are seen to be there to generation after generation. And sometimes it changes, right? Sometimes it's just nothing is more familiar in the history of art that sometimes there's a generation that finally says, okay, I don't see this. And in that case, that work falls out of the canon and other works come into the canon. So it's not a static process, it's an evolving process. The other thing I'll say about subjectivity and objectivity, when I talked about negative capability before, and when I talked about the capacity to enter a work, I believe there's something about the subjectivity created by literary study, careful literary study, literary criticism, that actually turns your subjectivity into a property of the object. And what I mean by that is Proust writes a lot about this, where he says, he's talking about a composer, an imaginary composer called Vinteuil. And he says that when you listen to Vinteuil's sonata, you are actually able to see the world and hear the world through Vinteuil's sensorium. Artworks are not like rocks or trees or clouds. They're artifacts created by human beings that had sensoriums that are like ours, that are human. And what they hold open to us is a different way of viewing the world. And we can actually look at the world as Milton saw it, right? We can imagine hell as Milton imagined it. And so in that sense, in a curious way, the line between subject and object gets blurred. And so there's an objective quality to the critic's judgments, even as there's always a subjective quality to it, if that makes sense.
Now, you talk about how the criteria of the market has not only become more important, but its importance has accelerated in recent years, perhaps because of digital transmission and so forth. And so how exactly has the authority of literary critics and professors of literature declined? I mean, I think as somebody who's trying to figure out like what to read, for me, it's like if I'm trying to figure out what to read, I go and look and see what other people are saying. I go to, I mean, if it's not a classic, I go and look at TLS or whatever, and they kind of tell me, go read this, don't waste your time on that, and so forth. Has that profession of literary advisory services, expertise faded out? And then not just in terms of selecting what to read, but how to read. Where are people going to figure out how to read and how to evaluate literature? Because it does seem like the universities, we're not doing our jobs in that respect.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And in fact, my friends and I just put on a conference at the University of Chicago last week in which we asked the question, what happens to literary criticism at the end of the university, or at the moment in which the university and literature departments are no longer fulfilling that function, when so many literature departments have taken up a vision of their work as political activism as opposed to aesthetic education. And I'll say a couple things about that. The first is, as you say, from your own experience, the desire for aesthetic education, the desire to have one's taste be guided, to know what books one should look at, how one should read those books, how one should spend one's precious time. That desire is totally out there and is very strong and is not being met by literature departments in the way that I think they should. I think it's a tragedy and a big mistake that literature and art departments are no longer fulfilling that vital human need. And I think there's some movement to try to restore that. There's some movement just in recent years. For example, the reception of my book, I've been very gratified by. Lots of professors, lots of people have said, we need to get back to this. And so I think we're in a more hopeful place than we were maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But what you're finding is that different forum and scenes of people trying to fulfill this function and step into this gap are happening, like on Substack, on Reddit, on Amazon reviews. There's lots of places where people, Goodreads, you know what I mean? There are these other kinds of forums in which something like expertise, or at least careful and nuanced and argued judgments, are being offered for communities of readers. And so,
I mean, the problem there is that you wouldn't go there for your medical advice. You go to Substack to find out, what your cancer treatment ought to be.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. Unfortunately, lots of people do, increasingly. YouTube and so forth, vaccines, there's a whole discourse about that. It's part of the general. And I would say lots of these forums are not as good as they could be because they're just lacking a kind of training and education that would give these judgments a kind of authority and nuance that you don't often find on those sites. So those sites, I see it more as a symptom. And to some extent, the canon that you find on those forums are in fact the canon of classic literature, the classic literature syllabus. I'm not online a whole lot, but some of the folks at the conference were talking about all these online forums where people are talking about classic literature, whether it's Renaissance or modernism or whatever. And you do find there folks who are deeply educated in the arts, who may no longer be professors or may have wanted. I've met so many people who went to college and even dropped out of grad school wanting to be literature professors, didn't find that literature was doing what they thought it would be, and have another job now, but are still doing that work online and so forth. Part of the problem also is, as I said, the collapse of journalism. Journalism, it wouldn't have been as big a problem for literary studies to no longer being doing judgment in the 90s as it is now, because you had journalism and you had all these extraordinary book critics doing that work, having well-paid positions at the New York Times and other places. At your local newspaper, wherever you lived, had a book critic and a book section. With the decline of journalism, that has largely vanished. I mean, it really has been swept away. And so we really stand as a society and as a culture in need of venues of aesthetic education. There's a need for it. There's an unmet demand for it. There's different areas and forums and venues in which people are trying to meet that demand. But there's really no replacement for what the universities are doing. And to my mind, the easiest solution to this problem is for literary studies in the university to rediscover its ethos, the reason for public support, and to get back to doing this kind of work.
Well, I mean, those outside of the university activities, they don't seem like any kind of perfect substitute for the kind of back and forth that you see in a university environment where there can be institutional filtration of high quality and low quality work. But I mean, you talk about how the field of literary criticism and art criticism, art history and so forth, have become professionalized to some degree. They see themselves as being in the knowledge creation business. I mean, can you ever have a pedagogy that is radically different from what you're doing on the research side? I mean, doesn't the research itself and the publication itself have to also kind of start engaging aesthetic judgment if you're going to have aesthetic training and education happen at the teaching level?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. So one thing I talk about is the danger of any English literature professor is for my judgments to turn into some kind of tyranny, where I'm just saying, these are just my own tastes. You've got to read this, and I'm putting it on the syllabus and go for it. And that's why I say, and it's a real question, I'll just say parenthetically, the relation of research in the humanities to pedagogy. Too often there's a sense of a divide. But that's why I say that if I'm assigning a book and I'm going to direct students to a feature of the book, if I can't imagine writing a scholarly article about the feature that I'm talking about, then I really have no right teaching it, because the check on my authority as a professor is the community of peers, of other scholars, of other critics, of other literary researchers and teachers. And there needs to be a forum in which I can share my perspective on a given work, and through the peer review process, the responses in other articles and books, that gets refined, that gets taken up, challenged, and changed through that conversation. Too often what you see is a kind of divide where you'll have, to my mind, the bizarre spectacle of the humanities professor who says, I need more time for my research, and my teaching is this kind of afterthought. Humanities, really, teaching and research are part of the same continuum, because ultimately, my goal as a humanist is not to produce knowledge. My goal as a humanist is to produce transformation of persons, to give people an aesthetic education, to give them an expanded, enriched sense of the world and of life through literature. And everything should be a means to that end, in my view, in terms of scholarship, the whole continuum. And I look as a guide for that, the great moment of literary studies in the post-war period. It was the most democratic moment when you had colleges relatively inexpensive. The GI Bill was sending millions of folks to college for the first time. And you had the development of the new critics who were saying, look, we can't rely on these students having this kind of deep background in literature as we could from earlier upper class generations. We're going to just use this method of close reading to take works, to show them how to appreciate and understand those works. And the generation, very often when I give talks, folks who are older now, but who had received their training in that era, will speak to me about how powerful that was for them, how it unlocked a kind of world that as a first-generation college student, they may never have imagined existed. So that's the trend, that transformation, that's what it's all about for me. Aesthetic education in that transformative sense, that is the reason for why you should have English departments in a research university. And I think, and I'll just say, having been in this profession for 20 years, I don't think there's any other good rationale or defense of having this strange phenomenon, which people in the 19th century were skeptical about, and people today are skeptical about, of having humanists in a research university, these multi-billion-dollar operations. Aesthetic education, that's something important that we can do. Every other justification of what we do, whether it be a kind of political activism or whether it be a kind of quasi-linguistic research or quasi-historical research, those don't seem to me to be as compelling justifications as the one of aesthetic education.
So the way in which folks like Lionel Trilling reconciled egalitarianism with hierarchy of aesthetic judgment was to sort of make it available to the masses rather than subject it to the pre-existing desires and preferences of the masses. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You put it very simply. There's two modes of egalitarianism with respect to the arts. One is to say, I don't have to teach you anything. You're good as you are. You just choose what you want to choose and keep on rocking. And the other way is to say, there is a difference between higher and lower pleasures. And I want to make it democratically available to the widest possible public that we can through education, through the institutions of education. That's really a stark choice. There's two entirely different worldviews between those two. And I'm very firmly on the side of the latter, which is to say, because it's my own experience, you know what I mean? Like really simply, it's transformed my life and I want to give it to other people. And it's a tragedy, which it's been true for a couple of decades now, that the people who can afford to study the arts are very often people whose situations, whose family backgrounds mean that they do not have to focus on something instantly remunerative. And that is profoundly anti-democratic. And when you couple that with the kind of reigning ideology in the university, which is this kind of everyone's good where they are, this market egalitarianism, you've really kind of disabled the possibility of democratic aesthetic education.
And I think people in the arts are now forced to justify themselves by saying that it's going to make people more productive or boost the economy or something like this.
I mean, yeah, there's that. Really, the reigning one, creates the current crisis that we're all experiencing in universities. Most recently, the most common way of justifying the study of arts and the creation of art has been it's going to forward a certain kind of political activism, certain kinds of progressive goals. That's what we're doing. And of course, the problem with that is the majority of America is not interested in those goals, feels those goals to be alien to their own desires and so forth. And that has made humanists in particular, but universities in general, abjectly vulnerable. And it is incentivized politicians to just go after universities and attack them. You know what I mean? If I'm in a position where I'm saying the whole reason of what I do is to advance the cause of defunding the police, the fact that the majority of Americans is not, especially people in minority and working class and lower class backgrounds, if they reject that, if they're not interested in that, then I've got a huge target around my neck, which is the situation we currently find ourselves in.
Now, look, you are not only a professor of literature, but you also create literature yourself. Right? And normally we've had this division of labor. So the art historians and the art practice folks are typically non-overlapping. And yet I think most people who want to appreciate art can improve their appreciation by doing a little bit of art themselves, even if they're never going to be any good. Is this a problem, this division of labor? Has this always been a problem? I mean, should we think more about exposing critics to the creative process in themselves? Because certainly creative artists, they're familiar with art history. They're familiar with literary history. They probably couldn't be very creative if they weren't. But is there a problem going in the other direction?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is, as a first response, is for me, I think there's a widespread sense that criticism and artistic creation are somehow opposed. But I'll tell you, there was a very particular moment that made me want to be a critic, which was I had some friends, when I was 15, I had some friends that were older than me that I would hang out with. And when I started hanging out with them, I had the idea that when you make a joke, if you analyze it, it kills it. People are familiar with that. You make a joke, you analyze it, it kills it. But these guys, what they would do is they would make a joke that was funny. And then they would analyze it, and it would just get funnier. And it would get funnier and funnier. And they would think about it more and bring out different elements, and it would just get funnier and funnier and crazier and crazier. And to me, it was a revelation. It was like, wow, the more you think about art or aesthetic phenomenon like jokes, music, movies, whatever, the more of that magic you get. You know what I'm saying? So I always saw it as like not opposed to my activities as a creative writer, but as really kind of going hand in hand with it. Now, I'll say there are some folks who I admire who are working now that sort of combine creative writing and criticism in the same kind of work. I always keep them separate. Like I write in a very different voice for my creative work than I do in my scholarly or critical work. But I do that just because I have the faith that really looking into the work will bring out that magic if I use the scholarly tools. And at the same rate, it'll also somehow unlock things that I can use in my creative practice. But, I was always interested in being a writer as well as being a reader from an early age. And that in part has led me to the bias I have, which is away from viewing works purely as sort of historical documents or as staking out political positions, and really wanting to bring the critical side of things back to that moment of magic, which is just like literature creates something new in the world. Literature gives you a way of seeing something that couldn't otherwise be seen. So that's the kind of common root for me where it starts.
And do you ask your students to do creative work in your literature classes? I mean, I remember one of the best literature classes I ever took was on memoirs, actually. And some of our assignments involved us writing memoirs. It was with this guy, Frank Bowman, back at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was a French literature guy.
Yeah. I don't. I mean, and the reason for that is creative writing is hugely popular. Lots of folks want to take creative writing classes. And so I've always felt what's needed for those creative writers is more occasions for them to write their own stuff and really efforts to get them like really powerful and inspiring models. And I do use creative writing in a limited way to try to do that. So what I'll do is I'll give them a passage from a writer, and then I'll ask them to say that a different way. Like we'll all try to say it in a way different than this writer did. And what we'll discover through that process is how easy it would have been to ruin that the way that they said it. You know what I'm saying? And so it inculcates a kind of humility and a kind of that negative capability Keats talks about. Because our society gives us a lot of confidence. This goes back to the consumer choice thing in what I think and what I see and what I know. What I've needed as a writer and what I think my students respond to is that kind of sense of humility, which is let's clear the way for real aspiration and real ambition. Let's look at something that I could never have written something this good. Talk about Emily Dickinson or something like that. Like, let's just look at this and like really marvel at it and get a kind of high goal for ourselves. I don't think that's opposed to the values of creative writing. I think that's like totally the kind of thing that writers need to be doing. And I feel like they don't get a lot of other opportunities to do that in straight creative writing classes.
Well, Michael, thanks so much. It's been a great conversation. The book is called Defense of Judgment, but don't forget the other books. Talk again soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thank you for tuning in to the Unsiloed podcast produced by University FM. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review in your favorite listening app. To listen to our other episodes, please visit our website at www.unsiloedpodcast.com.